These podcasts are being released in conjunction with the 5th National Climate Assessment. They feature conversations among NCA authors and staff about the report, the science behind the report, and the participants' experiences and perspectives. They do not represent official positions of the United States government. Enjoy!
Welcome to the companion podcast of the 5th National Climate Assessment. My name is Allison Crimmins, and I'm the director of the 5th National Climate Assessment, the United States government's preeminent report on climate change, its impacts, and how we are responding. I've been working on climate change my entire career, and my husband is also a scientist. He works on cancer. So I often joke that between the two of us, the climate scientists and the cancer scientists, we really know how to bring the gloom and doom to the party. But the National Climate Assessment and this podcast episode is not about doom and gloom. In fact, it's about all the many things that people are doing all around the country to address climate change, to reduce emissions and prepare for impacts. And there is a lot about this report that should give people courage. In fact, I want to start this episode by giving you 3 reasons why you should have courage. 3 reasons to know that we're headed in the right direction. First is that we've advanced the conversation on climate change in this country. I used to complain to my husband that he spends zero amount of his time convincing people that cancer is real and serious and that we should do something about it. Meanwhile, of course, I have spent an enormous amount of my time debunking myths and misinformation and talking about how climate change is real, how it's caused by us humans emitting greenhouse gases from burning fossil fuels, and how the impacts of climate change can be devastatingly bad. But both the science and the conversation on climate change in the US has really changed dramatically in the last few years. We've come a long way from convincing people climate change is real, that it's caused by us, and that it's bad. The conversation I'm hearing more and more now is, what are we doing about it? And I think that is a great place to be starting the conversation. The second reason I'm going to give you for why you should have courage is that not only have we made progress in our thinking, we've also made progress in our doing, in the advancements around measures to reduce greenhouse gases and strengthen community resilience. Efforts to adapt to climate change and reduce greenhouse gas emissions across the US have expanded since the previous assessment came out in 2018, and US emissions have fallen since peaking in 2007. This trend was largely driven by changes in how we produce energy. Our coal use has declined, while use of natural gas and renewable technologies has increased. We've seen a lot of growth in wind and solar capacity. We've seen improved battery storage technologies and innovations in electric vehicles. This transition to zero and low carbon energy technologies is supported by rapidly falling costs and policies and investments at the federal, state, and city levels, which can support even deeper emission reductions. Climate action is underway in every part of the US. Third, and finally, is that the power to combat climate change lies within our hands. It's right within our grasp. The science tells us that not only is reaching net zero emissions by the middle of this century achievable, but we know that every action we take to reduce emissions and avoid climate damages leads to benefits that go beyond just climate change. This report talks about how, in addition to reducing risk to future generations, rapidly reducing emissions would have immediate health and economic benefits, like improved air quality and new clean energy jobs, reduced energy costs, and healthier ecosystems. And we know that the benefits of those deep emission cuts far outweigh the costs. So the choices we make today can result in both near-term benefits for our generation and long-term benefits for future generations. So those are 3 great big reasons why it is not all gloom and doom and why you should have climate courage. Of course, it's not all sparkles and rainbows either. Climate change is a very serious issue, and the science tells us that to address it, we all need to take action. We're already seeing the effects of accelerating sea level rise, intensifying extreme weather, and other interacting impacts increase as the planet warms. And the science also tells us that if we do nothing, things will get worse. Each additional increment of warming is expected to lead to more damage and greater economic losses than the previous increment of warming, while the risk of catastrophic or unforeseen consequences also increases. If we want to avoid or limit those severe climate risks to the US, both today and in the future, we're going to need even deeper cuts in global net emissions, as well as accelerated adaptation efforts. In other words, we're going to need both courage and action. We have every reason to be courageous in the face of climate change. We have what we need: the tools, the knowledge, the resources, the science to make a difference. The fifth National Climate Assessment finds that an equitable and sustainable US response to climate change that integrates diverse worldviews, cultures, and experiences into mitigation and adaptation actions has the potential to reduce climate impacts to overburden communities while also improving well-being, strengthening resilience, benefiting the economy, and addressing social and environmental injustices. Climate action is also an opportunity to make these improvements in our country and in our lives.
Coming up.
A personal observation I've made over the last few years, fewer and fewer people are asking me questions about basic climate science 101 or, asking me to explain the greenhouse gas effect. And instead, they want to talk about solutions. So I've seen this real shift in the conversation from it's real, it's bad, it's us, to more of what are we doing about it?
NCA5 authors Rebecca Dodder and Emily Wasley talk response actions, science, mitigation, and adaptation.
We are here to talk about innovation in mitigation and adaptation, and I'm joined today by Emily Wasley, who's the head of resilience and biodiversity at a large global tech company and formerly with WSP. And Emily is also the chapter lead on the NCA5 adaptation chapter. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you, Allison. It's great to be here to talk about our chapter, and we're excited to have this released.
And I am also joined by Rebecca Dodder, who's the Associate National Program Director for the Air, Climate, and Energy Program at the Environmental Protection Agency and the coordinating lead on our mitigation chapter. Thank you for joining us, Rebecca.
Thanks, Allison. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
It's great to have you both here. I wanted to start off by asking both of you about a personal observation I've made over the last few years, that fewer and fewer people are asking me questions about basic climate science 101 or, asking me to explain the greenhouse gas effect. And instead, they want to talk about solutions. So I've seen this real shift in the conversation from it's real, it's bad, it's us, to more of what are we doing about it? And I especially see this when I'm talking to younger people and students. So Emily, let me turn to you first. Have you seen this same kind of shift in your work?
Yes, absolutely. People in general are just extremely eager to get into the solution space because about 80% of Americans understand that climate change is happening. In terms of solving the climate crisis, younger generations, people who are on the ground, new practitioners, are extremely eager and driven.
I'll also agree that working in the mitigation space, there's a lot more interest in terms of not only what are the solutions, but is the solution better than that one? And people thinking really broadly about the whole system, whether it's electric power or transportation or buildings. So I think we are seeing a lot of interest in mitigation. And I think a lot of it is because we're also seeing in our daily lives a lot more of these technologies and innovations deployed.
Emily, do you think people have a good sense of what adaptation is?
I think more and more people are starting to realize what adaptation is and why it's needed, but the terminology can be confusing because there are a lot of words out there such as resilience, risk mitigation, adaptation that get interchanged, and they do mean different things. So adaptation really refers to a process or action that changes a living thing so that it's better able to survive in a new environment, a new climate. Whereas resilience really describes the capacity or the ability to anticipate and cope with shocks, to recover from those impacts in a timely and efficient manner. So using these terms interchangeably can be confusing to people. But when we talk about adaptation, we're really thinking about both incremental changes that we can make, both as humans as organizations, as governments, and as global bodies, but also transformative adaptation. And the incremental adaptation is more prevalent these days. Examples are kind of using air conditioning or cooling centers during heat waves, temporarily reducing water consumption or increasing irrigation to address frequent droughts, or elevating homes above floodwaters, or even using sandbags to resist coastal erosion. The transformative adaptation is lagging quite significantly. And that includes, redesigning cities and buildings that address heat, or shifting water-intensive industries to match new rainfall patterns, directing new housing developments to less flood-prone areas. So we really talk about in our chapter, both measures are needed, incremental and transformative, but because of the pace of climate change, the transformative adaptation that is harder and takes much more intention and strategy is really necessary if we are going to adapt effectively to the pace of climate change.
So Emily just gave us an amazing definition of adaptation. So now I've got to ask Rebecca if you could give us a definition of mitigation, just so we're all on the same page here.
Mitigation is really referring to efforts to reduce emissions, and this can be reducing all greenhouse gas emissions, or you can also remove carbon from the atmosphere. And so the goal of that is to avoid or reduce the effects of climate change. So this is different from trying to adapt our systems and activities to an already changed climate. So it's more of the avoidance of those future impacts.
And these two things, are not in complete separate silos, mitigation and adaptation. They often can be very complementary from one another, right?
I absolutely would say that mitigation and adaptation could be and should be, wherever possible, complementary. And coming off of this really hot summer that we've had, I would think about buildings and our built environment. How do we think about the spaces that we live in and work in and go to school and shop? How can we think about these spaces in terms of not only reducing their energy demand, but can we design them in ways that just help us keep cool and comfortable during these extreme heat events? So how can we think about innovations in the building design, advanced air conditioning, improved building envelope? Can we also use more natural and green infrastructure and really reduce that need for cooling demand? So I think to the extent possible, really making sure that those are complementary is key to achieving both.
I would agree 100%. It's really important that when we are investing in climate change mitigation, that we consider solutions for adaptation. They provide co-benefits. You can invest in one solution that can address both climate mitigation and adaptation. We're seeing more and more emphasis on pairing these two types of solutions together to not only save money, save time, but also invest in the local communities in a more integrated and innovative way.
And I'd like to build on something that you said in your answer, Emily. You mentioned renewable energy. So if we can deploy these systems in a way that help the grid become more resilient after disasters, but they can also provide co-benefits in terms of reduction of co-emitted air pollutants. I think it goes beyond just the adaptation and mitigation connections, but just can we help advance some of these other outcomes?
Emily, your chapter also talks about other forms of adaptation that maybe go beyond just what we tend to think of first, the technology kind of things, or even some of the things you mentioned, like air conditioning or sandbags, the kind of physical things. Your chapter talks about adaptation in policy and in finance and in our actual practices. I'm wondering if you can give us some more examples of adaptation in some of those less tangible sectors.
So as you mentioned, there are different creative and innovative ways now we're seeing financing of adaptation solutions through insurance or different grants, land-based trust. We're seeing early warning and observing systems for heat and drought and wildfire. Those really help communities understand and prepare for the acute events that they're going to face, but also can see the trends happening a little bit more significantly earlier on. We've also seen an increase in capacity building, so education and training, different schooling levels that are getting training in how to think about climate change and the risks that communities are facing, and then how to prepare for that as an individual, as an organization, and as a global community. And technology is really accelerating in terms of solar and storage and wind power, a lot of the mitigation spaces that also provide co-benefits for adaptation. AI and machine learning are really accelerating as well and offering us ways to capture trends, be able to look at those trends more quickly, more readily, and to be able to deploy that and to translate that into decision useful information.
Both of your chapters have an amazing graphic showing how all around the country, states have been advancing mitigation and adaptation actions. I think one of our advancements that we're really highlighting in NCA5 is that a lot of these states and cities are not just evaluating risks or writing these strategies, they're actually implementing them. Maybe I'll turn to Rebecca first. Do you have any specific examples of a community where they've been taking these innovative climate mitigation strategies and actually implementing them in their communities?
I think one good example is in our chapter, we discuss Orlando and look at the number of things that they're working on. One is waste reduction, use of anaerobic digestion facilities that take the gray water and the food scraps from all of the parks and resorts to generate biogas and create this renewable energy source that can then power some of these facilities. Orlando is also the largest rental car market in, I think, the world. And so this has been a proving ground for some EV and looking at how to be ready for electric vehicles. But another fun thing was to really look across the different chapters and look to see for the regional chapters, just all the really interesting and innovative approaches that different regions and towns and cities were taking, from kelp farming that can both help with the effects of ocean acidification, but also create sources of revenue and enhance the carbon sinks. A lot of work in the Great Plains and in a lot of our really important agricultural regions on enhancing soil carbon. Again, that's helping not only adapt to future conditions, but it's also helping to store that additional carbon in the soils.
And even though those might be tailored to a specific city, Emily, are you seeing a lot of communities learning from one another from these cases where they've been implementing mitigation or adaptation actions and maybe learning some best practices or maybe what not to do?
Yes, communities are definitely learning from each other. There are some regional collaboratives that have been formed across different jurisdictions in the US that are sharing lessons learned, that are sharing what not to do, what didn't work well, as you mentioned. And we have a lot of examples of adaptation not happening or missed opportunities where adaptation could have happened ahead of an event or ahead of the number of increases in different events that we've seen over time. But we are also seeing different pockets of communities that are adapting effectively and are centering equity into the way that they're adapting and really using participatory processes of including various different actors from different levels of government, different nonprofits, really empowering local voices to create the solutions that are going to be most effective for them. But we're also seeing a lot of that not happening. Our chapter really highlights areas of opportunity for improved embedding of equity throughout the decision-making process of adaptation. What does transformative adaptation look like? What are some examples? So it offers kind of a toolkit for those who are interested in effective adaptation. What might that look like? And how could I do that effectively by being inclusive and being intentional about who I'm including in the decision-making process from the start?
For mitigation, I think there's been a lot of advancements in thinking about how the deployment of new technologies or mitigation solutions can, like you say, help advance equity, help address existing environmental justice concerns. One area where people are starting to look, for example, are thinking about broadly about the life cycle impacts of technologies as they're deployed. And I think we're also gaining a lot of good information and data to be able to quantify the potential co-benefits to be able to do those better. And so understanding, for example, the reduction in air pollution as we switch from fossil fuels to lower emitting or zero emissions technologies. What do those health benefits look like as we make those transitions? And can we make sure that the health benefits are going to the communities that have been historically the most overburdened in terms of air quality or other environmental stressors?
Any last takeaways that you want to leave our audience with?
I do feel this national climate assessment is taking it to another level. And I'm hopeful that readers of our chapter for adaptation will see not only a lot of optimism, a lot of reality, and a lot of different examples of ways that we can equitably and effectively adapt to the changes that we're already seeing in the climate. I also think that we're seeing a shift between not just investing in mitigation, but now truly investing in adaptation. More needs to be done in terms of those investments and where those investments go. But in terms of the dialogue around adaptation, it's becoming more mainstreamed and really a term that people are more familiar with. And I'm really hopeful that the co-benefits will be able to be realized if we intentionally think about both adaptation and mitigation at the same time.
I would say over time, I'm becoming increasingly more optimistic in terms of where we are going in terms of mitigation. And I think in part because the dialogue is shifting towards which solution is better? Is this one better than that one? Or how can we do this specific solution better in a way that has more benefits, that creates more of these co-benefits, for example? So I think we're seeing a lot of evolution of how we're talking about these technologies and just the array of options that are starting to come in.
Coming up.
When we got together and we started to brainstorm about our chapter, one thing that came out really quickly was that we were impressed that all of the states in the Northeast have started taking some kind of climate action.
NCA5 authors Jess, Whitehead and Tischa Muñoz-Erikson join us after the break to discuss actions communities are taking to strengthen resilience.
I'm very excited to be joined in this conversation by Jessica Whitehead. Jessica is the Executive Director of the Institute for Coastal Adaptation and Resilience at Old Dominion University, and she's the chapter lead of our Northeast chapter of the 5th National Climate Assessment. And I'm also joined today by Tischa Muñoz-Erikson, who's the Research Social Scientist at the International Institute for Tropical Forestry, which is a part of the U.S. Forest Service in Puerto Rico. And she is also a chapter author from the Built Environment chapter. Welcome, Jessica, and welcome, Tischa.
Thanks for having us, Allison.
Thank you.
I wanted to start off with a little bit of a definition. So resilience has been something of a buzzword lately. So for those who might be new to this space, we talked about mitigation and adaptation in our first section, but I wanted to hear from you what resilience is. What does that word mean to you, and how is it different from adaptation and mitigation?
The way that we define resilience in the NCA is the ability to prepare for threats and hazards, adapt to changing conditions, and withstand or recover rapidly from adverse conditions or disruptions. I like to phrase it as anything we do to make things less bad or make them better. And to capture that idea of not just preventing the risk, but acknowledging that sometimes where we started from can always be better. And so we can work forward and take advantage of those opportunities. It's a little bit different. It includes the concept of adaptation, which is the idea of adjusting to some actual or expected change in climate. And that concept of resilience then that is inclusive of adaptation means that you're not just thinking about things that are like the punching bag version of resilience, where you are measuring how much time it takes you to recover from disaster, but to think forward and to make sure that you're doing better.
I've heard of this sort of bouncing forward idea. So resilience not being just coming back to the state you started in, but getting better.
Coming from a background in environmental, natural science, ecology, I think the definition there broadens up a little bit resilience in the sense that it is about, being able to recover, but when conditions allow it, if you need to actually create a whole new system or change the things that made you vulnerable in the first place, then that's another way of thinking about it, that adaptation may be to a climate challenge, but sometimes maybe we need to rethink the whole thing because we're going to keep being reactive. So let's be more proactive and think about, well, how do we want our cities to look like in 20, 50 years so that we're climate adapted and disasters come, but they don't become disasters to us because we've built our communities and our infrastructure in a way that can anticipate those impacts.
And can you tell us, Jess, about some of the innovative resilience actions that are maybe happening at kind of the higher regional level or state level?
When we got together and we started to brainstorm about our chapter, one thing that came out really quickly was that we were impressed that all of the states in the Northeast have started taking some kind of climate action. Looking at the number of places, whether we're talking about the laws that have been passed in Massachusetts to go all zero emission vehicles by 2035, or the Connecticut now requirement to report on climate related risk and insurance resilience actions, or the New York Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act that includes a climate justice component and a climate justice requirement. This action was happening throughout the Northeast. There's even some interesting cross-jurisdictional collaboration that's going on within the Northeast. One good example of this is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And this is where all of the states in the Northeast, with the exception of West Virginia, are setting out these limited number of tradable allowances for carbon dioxide emissions. And they auction those off and use the proceeds of those auctions for action. I think that that's an example too of how we're starting to see this shift of how do I work with everyone else who's facing some of these same issues.
I'd love to hear more about the social equity and justice considerations in planning resilience actions.
New York City is an example that we draw on fairly heavily. And in particular, talking about the disproportionate health impact of extreme temperatures. And, they got to the point where they had local mandates to make sure that the populations who were affected were included. So that local legislation ensuring that environmental justice was the core principle of how those problems were addressed going forward is something that we see, not just even in New York City now, but in starting to come to fruition in other areas. We also talk a lot about tribal efforts. So indigenous peoples and tribal nations within the Northeast who are dealing with a lot of these past injustices and the historical legacies of forced relocation. There are a lot of examples now of how tribes are going and thinking about resilience and adaptation, and even partnering with the localities that surround the tribe, in particular in Massachusetts and Long Island, where they now have partnerships with those localities to do oyster reef restoration or to do sand dune restoration in a couple of cases.
And you were mentioning tribal communities, and even in the context of Puerto Rico, once you start digging, you find these different ways of inequality that intersect with climate impacts, and one of them being property ownership and informality, and in being able to have access to, like you said, certain processes, but also access to opportunities and tools that may come from the government, but you have to have some kind of formality. And so that extends obviously to communities all over. Actually live in Arizona. I do most of my work in Puerto Rico, but I live in Arizona. So I see those dynamics and they're very invisible, right? It's not like they're always obvious to us. So this kind of work and paying explicit attention from the science and scholarship is incredibly important because it's very nuanced, but also when you start looking at not just in terms of the impacts, but the benefits that to the whole planning process by being inclusive of these different voices, you're also including their knowledge. So you're also kind of bringing knowledge justice in the sense that you're really bringing in the people that are actually feeling the climate impacts more, right? Really having to deal from one crisis to another and learn to quickly adapt, whereas many of us are in the office with air conditioner and, and so we might not feel what's a climate crisis to most people, right? And so they have a certain knowledge and lived experience that is incredibly valuable to any climate mitigation adaptation process. But it is also the right thing to do, right? Because this is, again, a very complex challenge that we all have to come together and think about the sustainability of these things.
Tischa, you mentioned a couple of the benefits of some of these resilience actions beyond just climate benefits. I'm wondering if you can give us a few more examples of how building resilience in a community can strengthen other elements of the community as well.
Again, going back to experiencing a great disaster, hurricanes Irma and Maria were in Puerto Rico, I think I always go back to that because it just really highlights for me that difference in definitions and view of resilience and the implications of that with what responses we do. And so we have all these communities that were left uncommunicated. They were in rural areas where bridges were down, the government couldn't access them. We had a lot of issues that basically led to communities having to really fend for themselves post disaster and really take on the recovery. And for many months, when they did finally got back to normal conditions, they realized, you know what, this is not what we want to come back to, though. When we think about moving forward in our plans and how we're going to define the things that we're going to do from today to the future, like we don't want to be in the same position we were, the day before Maria. Obviously, there are some things that in our community we needed better access to health. The closest hospital is like 30 minutes away, and again in windy roads. Obviously, the electric system is unreliable. And they identify all these things that made them vulnerable outside of the hurricane. And then they also looked at their assets and they were like, this is an opportunity for us to not just talk about climate change, but to think about how we want to be in the future. It's going to make us more sustainable. How do we reach all these social, health, economic goals as we're planning for climate adaptation? And so they started a agritourism initiative. They have a community hub where they keep a lot of health resources and materials and medicines. So they're stocked, but it also serves as a regular community health center there.
Yes, are you seeing some of those same actions in the Northeast?
Yeah, a lot of the stories that we talk about in this space in the Northeast come from the tribal nations. So the wampum framework, I think, is one example of the primary concern of the Mi'kmaq Nation is warming winters and how they're thinking about how to proactively address community education and solar energy and rethink what it means to be a part of not just their community, but the forest and the wildlife and the duty to that care and that connection. In Baltimore, some of the work that they've done on this concept of resilience hubs and this community level resilience is really transformative. And you start to see that idea spreading to all of these other places.
What are you excited about 4 or 5 years down the road for NCA6? What sort of innovations in resilience do you see on our horizon?
I think there is a lot of innovations that are happening yet to be found. And so if we can start thinking already about how can we do better at assessing and capturing progress for drawing lessons and from those places, communities, expanding from cities, I think there's much more that we don't know, which is exciting to me because it means that the progress that we're seeing is probably a small fraction of what really there is. And so it's easy with climate change to sometimes focus on the challenges and the difficulty and how big and overwhelming. But I also think that it's because we've yet to really capture all those innovations and ways to move forward that if we can connect more around the shared experiences and the shared interests, but also vulnerabilities, it's something that maybe we can try to figure out how to make that work across many areas.
My thought as somebody who really is in this space of how do we get things done, we haven't even talked about the message on financing. The long story short is show me your budget and I'll show you your priorities. all of this progress costs money. Whether we're talking about building a huge project that involves a resilience park and nature-based solutions and all of these aspects, or we're talking about doing an educational effort in a community classroom that requires that teacher's time, all of these things have a dollar amount attached to them, and that's got to come from somewhere. And so how are people paying for this, and how are they using the funding to be able to enable action? I'm excited to see more documentation of what's being done and how it's being paid for in the private sector. That's something where we know that it's happening. We know that whole of community resilience doesn't just mean the government and the individual residents who live there. It's also the corporations and the economic engines of those places who also need to adapt and improve their resilience and reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
In this episode, you heard about mitigation and adaptation and resilience, and the many things that communities around the country are already doing to be a part of the climate solution, to strengthen their resilience and create a healthier, safer, more just nation. Talk about courage and action. Our country really has it. While we're facing some of the greatest challenges we've ever faced, we're also in a truly exhilarating time of transition. Transition in the way we talk about climate change in this country, a transition in our energy and transportation systems, how we power our homes and businesses, how we get around, how we produce and use food and other goods and services. And as our authors noted, we are seeing a transition in the ways that communities are working together to be a part of the climate solution. We're going to hear even more from those communities in our next episode when we take a virtual road trip around the country to learn about the unique impacts that people are experiencing in different neighborhoods. And of course, the inspiring actions that those neighbors are taking. I hope this episode has given you a shot of courage and also given you some new ideas about how to be part of the climate solution. Thank you for listening.
The NCA5 companion podcast was produced by the U.S. Global Change Research Program. These podcasts are intended to provide context and perspectives from the authors and participants of NCA5. They do not represent official positions of the United States government. Production by Chris Avery and Allison Crimmins, who also served as host. Editing, mixing, and scoring by Mallory Hinks. Thank you to our guests, Rebecca Dodder, Emily Wasley, Jess Whitehead, and Tischa Muñoz-Erikson. Thanks also to Eliza Lustig, Aaron Grade, Lori Howell, and Mike Cooperberg for their support in developing this series. The NCA is the U.S. government's premier report on climate change impacts, risks, and adaptation across the nation. It is a congressionally mandated interagency effort that brings together hundreds of experts from federal, state, and local governments, as well as the academic, nonprofit, and private sectors. Information about the NCA5, including the process used to create the assessment, can be found on the NCA5 website at nca2023.globalchange.gov.